before we go to St. Thomas Aquinas, I will first provide you with a short, well, hopefully it will be just a very brief background of philosophy and the history of philosophy. Um, we normally divide the development of philosophy between the two civilizations, I mean, between the two peoples. And when I say two civilizations, two peoples, I mean the Western and the Eastern civilizations. Okay? So, uh, philosophy in the West developed in Greece. It was first introduced by the Greeks. But of course, in the East, meaning in the Eastern civilization, we also have philosophy developing out of India and China. So there are also philosophies in India and China. There is Hinduism, there's Buddhism coming out of India. And there's also Taoism and Confucianism and the many other schools in China, Chinese philosophy. But of course, we are more interested in the Western civilization, Western philosophy, because that's where St. Thomas belongs. He's, he's a Westerner, he is a European, he is an Italian philosopher. So let's just briefly talk about how philosophy developed from the West. First developed in Greece, specifically during the pre-Socratic era. By pre-Socratic era, we mean that's about 5th century BC. Okay, it's 500 years before the coming of Christ in Greece. But of course, in Greece, the more active thinkers at the time who initiated this philosophical reflection are the Ionians or Milesians. So the Ionians is one of the tribes of the Greeks. There are, I think, 4 tribes that compose the Greeks, but one of them are the Ionians. So the Athenians and the Milesians belong to this group, the Ionians. So we normally refer to them as the Ionians. Miletus is one of the ancient cities in that part of the Aegean Sea. I mean, if you can imagine the that place between well, you have Italy and then Greece and then of course Turkey. That Mediterranean world. And the first philosophers, we normally call them the pre-Socratics. They ask about the nature of the world. What is the nature of the world? Okay, what is the nature of the world? What is the basic world stuff? That's a takeoff from the the mythology that prevailed in the thinking of the Athenians before the coming of the philosophers. So when we say philosophy, it's an attempt to provide a rational explanation for reality. We use our thoughts, we use our intellect to understand the underlying principles or the underlying causes of reality. It's a discipline which asks the question why? Why the changes? Why the permanence in the world? So that would basically characterize the Greek thinking about philosophy. Okay, and of course, you don't have to be a professional philosopher to think about the underlying meaning of certain things. People are, especially now that we are in a pandemic, we have more time to reflect, to meditate, to think about the underlying meanings. What is the meaning of all this? What are the profound lessons we can learn from this experience? Okay, so that's the business of philosophy. And the early Greek philosophers, they focused their energies, their attention to understanding the world. So we normally call their philosophies a cosmocentric philosophy because it's a philosophy that is uh, concerned with understanding the physical reality. But even when they try to understand physical reality, part of that physical reality, part of that cosmos is man. So they also ask about man. What is man? And that's where the answer of Aristotle is very important because he said man is a rational animal. One of the animals, but he is rational. Of course, before Aristotle, there was his teacher, Plato, who would say that man is a soul, practically a soul, who existed in some other world, in some divine world. So that's the meaning of that's philosophy. It tries to understand the underlying meaning of things, and the Greek philosophers focus on the nature of physical reality and in understanding what man is. Now, the next period in the history of philosophy would be the medieval period. And when we say medieval period, that's about that started after the fall of the Roman Empire and up to the 16th century, 1500s. So that's about 1,000 years. We call that the medieval period or the Middle Ages. But it's not an automatic, transition from the ancient Greek world to the medieval European Christian world. There is an intervening, there's a conduit, some kind of a transition, and this transition from the Greek to the Christians, well, you can actually say it's another very important period in the history of the Western civilization. Is the Roman Empire. What the Romans did, the Roman civilization, because the Greeks, well, of course, the Greeks, they dominated for a time through Alexander the Great, this great Macedonian king, dominated, conquered the world. But after the conquest of the Macedonians, of Alexander the Great, well, there may be some other military forces, but the most important here is the Roman Empire. The Romans, they have integrated into their culture, into their civilization, the Greek culture. That's why we have this, what we call the Greco-Roman culture or the Greco-Roman civilization, something like that. So the Romans somehow integrated this Greek culture into their own culture. But not just about the Romans, because one important development in the history of the Western world is the establishment of the Christianity, of the Christian religion. So Christ, of course, Christianity was established through the teachings of Christ. And from the teachings of Christ, from the ministry of Christ, emerged a group, a group of believers, which would later become the Christians and would establish Christianity as one of the most important religions in the world. Christianity. So you have the Greek civilization, Greek culture, and then the Romans, and then you have the emergence of Christianity. Now, at the beginning, of course, we know where Christianity started. It started in Israel, in the Holy Land. But eventually, the apostles, the followers of Jesus, spread throughout Europe. And, of course, they reached Rome, and Rome became the center of Christianity. But it was not a very easy establishment because, of course, we know that the early Christians were persecuted by the Romans. They were fed to the lions. They were, forced to participate in prize fighting, this gladiator thing, and they were even burned to light the streets of Rome. So they were persecuted. The early Christians were persecuted until eventually one particular emperor Constantine. He was converted to Christianity, and he declared that Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. So now, from being persecuted, the Christians can now fully express and practice their belief. So that's how the Christians eventually developed, so it eventually flourished into a very dominant religion. Now, why am I saying this? Because that will be the philosophy that will dominate, the Christian philosophy will dominate the medieval world. They will take philosophy, they will use philosophy in order for them to explain their Christian faith. So the early leaders of the church, meaning the fathers of the church, Saint Augustine, Saint Anselm, Saint Ambrose, they use philosophy in order to explain their faith. So it's a philosophy that combines reason and faith. But of course, the center of that faith is God. So this philosophy is now called a theocentric philosophy because it tries to explain it tries to explain reality on the basis of one's faith, on the basis of the belief, on the belief in God. God who created the world, the God who loved man so much that when man fell into sin, he sent his son to redeem man in the person of Christ. So it's a combination now of the teachings of the Greeks, the use of reason of the Greeks. And by the way, reason for the Greek is called logos, the logos. And the early Christians combined this Greek philosophy with their Christian faith. So it's a combination of the logos, okay, of the logos and faith, or reason and faith, fides, ratio. And that would characterize philosophy during the time of St. Thomas. So St. Thomas would be influenced by this because he would actually be using philosophy to explain the theology of the church. He would be one of the great thinkers of the church. But the early Christians during the medieval era were particularly influenced by the philosophy of Plato. I will explain later on the philosophy of Plato. While the latter Christians, in latter philosophy, the scholastics, they were influenced mainly by Aristotle. They were influenced by other philosophies, but they were influenced mainly by Aristotle. Now, what's the difference between the philosophy of Plato and the philosophy of Aristotle? Plato believed in a world that is different from this world that we live in. He calls it the world of forms or the world of ideas. It's a perfect world, perfect happiness, perfect knowledge. But aside from this world, he recognizes the physical world, this world that we live in. But this world that we live in is not a perfect world. It's just an imperfect copy of that perfect world. And the soul existed in the world of forms, in that perfect world, and it was expelled from that perfect world and got united with a physical body, with a material body. So the material body, this body that we have now, is some kind of a prison for the soul. When the soul was in the world of forms, it was contemplating about the ideas, about knowledge, but when it got united with the body, it forgot everything. But of course, the soul must struggle, it must labor in order that it will be reunited, go back to the world of forms. So it's a two-world theory of Plato. The second, or Aristotle, who studied under Plato for almost 20 years in his school called the Academy, studied that idea, that philosophy of Plato. But later on, he left the school and established his own philosophy, which actually turned out to be a more comprehensive philosophy than the philosophy of Plato. And what is the whole idea of Aristotle? He rejected the idea of Plato that there is a world of forms. For him, this world that we live in is a real world. And the ideas do not exist in some extra, extraterrestrial or some supernatural realm. Our ideas are in the mind. We form ideas based on our experiences, based on our observation of reality. Okay? So my idea of justice is based on what I experience of justice here. My idea of beauty is based on how I perceive things that are beautiful. So there's no separate idea of beautiful that exists in some other world, but only the idea that I have in my mind, which is actually taken from my experience of the things in the physical world of the things that are beautiful. So these are two different types of philosophy. Now, the early Christians follow this idea of Aristotle, of Plato rather, that there are two worlds, especially the philosopher and theologian Saint Augustine of Hippo. He was one of the most important philosopher during the early period of the medieval times. He used the idea of Plato to explain the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man. He said that that idea of Plato of the king of the perfect world is actually the kingdom of God. We came from the kingdom of God. That's the perfect world. That's the perfect place. That's heaven. That's paradise. We are in this world and we are just traveling. We are like pilgrims. And our purpose is to go back to the world, to that perfect world, to be reunited with God. And we can only be reunited with God if we have faith. Because if we have faith, then we make ourselves worthy of the grace of God. Okay, so it's a different kind of it's it's a perfect fit for the Christian doctrines. Now, Aristotle, on the other hand, his philosophy was studied by the Arabs. Okay, because uh, the Arab philosophers, they were also looking for, you know, uh, a philosophy that would be the basis, the rational foundation of their faith, of their Islamic faith. And they found this in Aristotle. So the early Christians are Platonic. Aristotle inspired the Arabs. But later on, uh, the Christians, the Christian thinkers, towards the later part, the part of the Middle Ages, they started reading Aristotle, and they were influenced by Aristotle. Of course, they still study the philosophy of Plato, but they are more now focused on the philosophy of Aristotle. And one of these philosopher is Saint Thomas Aquinas. But Saint Thomas Aquinas did not do it all alone because he was also influenced, or he studied under a Dominican who was also into Aristotle, and that is his teacher Saint Albert the Great. Okay, so the medieval philosophy would be more of a theocentric philosophy because it's centered on the belief in God. Now, that would reach its point during the 13th century, 1200. But of course, after the 13th century, there would be some kind of a decline in the scholastic philosophy until the Renaissance. So the Renaissance would signal a new age, which we call the modern era, the modern age. So during the 15th century or the 16th century, 1500s, uh, people, the Europeans, the thinkers, would try to go back to the Greeks for inspiration. They didn't like to, they are not fans of scholastic philosophy. So they went back to the Greeks, to the Greek classic, because for them that's the classical period. And what kind of philosophy did they espouse? Well, they focus more on their reason. They focus more on sense experience. And through this, they were able to discover the physical laws that govern the world. So the world has its own deterministic laws, natural laws, physical laws. And through these laws, we'll be able to explain the things that happen in the world. There's no more need to, to refer to God as the cause of everything, because the world is like a machine and it has its own laws. And these laws were discovered, of course, by Renaissance thinkers like Nicholas of Cusa, uh, Nicholas Copernicus, Galileo, Newton. So they provided us with a physical model of the world. And they also, well, affirm, stress the importance of reason and experience, of empirical data, empirical evidence, instead of relying on one's faith. So the philosophy of the moderns are more rationalistic, they're more empirical, and in general, they are anthropocentric, meaning anthropocentric, they focus more on the natural capacities of man instead of relying on faith. So that development, that modern kind of thinking, reached its highest point in the period of Enlightenment. Okay? Enlightenment would be the 18th century, 18th, early 19th century. But in the 19th century, another development happened. Thinkers are more focused now on human existence. They are more focused on human affairs, the human condition, etc., etc. Until now, we have different philosophies explaining our human situation. So that's how Western philosophy developed. Now, and we situate St. Thomas in the modern or in the medieval period, especially during the scholastic period. Okay, so let's zero in now on the scholastic period. That's third century. That's 1200. Okay, all right. So that's a rather long introduction to this discussion on the time of Saint Thomas. So there are probably four factors, four events that significantly influence the life and the career of Saint Thomas Aquinas. First, there is the birth, the founding of the Mendicant orders. The Mendicant orders are the Franciscans and the Dominicans. So we call the Dominicans, they are the Order of Preachers, OP, and the Franciscans are called the Order of Friars Minor, OFM. Of course, the Franciscans, they have already branched out to different. There are many different congregations of Franciscans. There are the Capuchins, and there are uh, the Recollects. Okay, so there are many strands now of Franciscans, but the Dominicans, they remain one congregation. Okay, they remain one congregation. Then, of course, the conflict between the church and the empire, and then the foundation of the universities, and then the controversy and triumph of Aristotelianism. So I will be discussing this one by one. Right. So first, if you have question, just uh, feel free to chat. Okay, so because uh, I will just go on not, with my lecture unless you have some questions, and I hope you are still there. Okay. Uh, so first, the birth of the Mendicant order, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. So at about here, early 13th century marked the rebirth of the evangelical spirit that grew into the two great Mendicant orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. And here we can see that the Dominicans and the Franciscans, they are making themselves available. They're sending their friars to every place where people gathered to meet them and preach the gospel. Before the Franciscans and the Dominicans, there were actually two uh, types of priests or congregations. You have uh, the monks, and the monks, they live out their, they stayed in their monastery, and they work for their personal sanctification, and they also do their own labors. One perfect example of these are the Benedictines. So they are cloistered in their monastery. They live in the monasteries because during that period, they think or they thought that the world is full of temptation. And if you want to work for your sanctification, then you retire from the world and retire to the forest to live like hermits. Okay, mono means one, meaning the monastic life is to live alone in the forest like hermits. Although eventually there are many hermits there trying to live the same way of life. Eventually they form a congregation. They form the monasteries. So hindi na rin sila nag-iisa, marami na rin sila. The other are the canon regulars. The canon, the canons, uh, the canons. These are the counterpart today of the canons are the secular priests. Okay? So, but the canons, the canon regulars, they also live like the monks. They also they live in their own cloisters in their monasteries. So the Franciscans and the Dominicans are different in the sense that instead of staying inside, they went out to preach the gospel. Okay? So they established contact with the outside world aside from uh, just not just staying inside. So the these preachers, these friars, they were this is a new type of vocation and a new mode of religious life because they made themselves available, okay, to the world. So this is a new kind of congregation, and aside from this, they profess a rigid voluntary vow of poverty. So if the if the concern is that if you go out of the world, you will be tempted. Okay, uh, will be influenced by the world. The Dominicans and the Franciscans, they profess a very strict vow of poverty, and that actually uh, shielded them from from all these the dead weight temptations, the seductions of the world. Okay? So these new orders. By the way, they are called mendicants because they are literally beggars. Okay, they are beggars. They went around begging for food. Okay? Now Saint Thomas would enter the Dominican Order, so he would be one of the mendicants. Okay, so it's very important, no, in the life of Saint Thomas. Now the second is the conflict between the church and the empire. You see, Saint Thomas's family lived in a small town. That's the town of Aquino, that is situated between Naples below and Rome above. I mean, if you imagine the the map of Italy, so you have Naples here and then Rome on top, and then in between that is a small town of Aquino. And there's a constant conflict between the Pope and the Emperor. Okay, mainly because of territorial disputes. So around 1238 to 1239, an armed conflict between the Emperor Frederick II and Pope Gregory ensued when Pope Gregory the Ninth excommunicated Frederick. During the medieval times, the Pope is so influential, so powerful, that it actually settles dispute. It's actually the Pope who put crowns on the on the head of kings and emperors. So he's a very influential position. Okay, so uh, an armed conflict ensued. Okay, when uh, the Pope excommunicated the Emperor Frederick II, and what the outrage, what Frederick did was to ravage all the papal states, all the papal territories. Okay? So the Pope was forced to form an army. You can imagine the Pope raising his own army to fight the Emperor. Okay? So he raised an army, and in fact, during the early part of the war, of the conflict, the papal troops were actually winning. They were taking fortress after fortress from the imperial armies, and they actually forced their way towards the town of Casino, which is the imperial headquarters, okay, in Casino, Monte Cassino. So at that time, the abbot in the monastery was the uncle of Saint Thomas, because Saint Thomas's family is actually well connected, uh, and in fact, the family of Saint Thomas is a relative of the emperor. So the abbot, who is the head of the monastery, it was placed in a difficult position because, of course, as a churchman, he owes obedience to the Pope. But the emperor is also he's a relative, so maybe it's blood thicker than water. He decided to to side with the emperor. Okay, so decided to with the emperor, but during the early part of the conflict, the Pope was actually winning. So he decided to, shift, change allegiance, and he sided with the Pope. But unfortunately for him, towards the end, the Pope lost the battle. He found himself on the losing side, and the imperial forces actually uh, forced its way to the abbey, to the monastery, and they actually killed some of the monks there. Okay, so Saint Thomas was in the monastery at the time because he was sent to that monastery when he was just 5 years old. So together with some monks, he had to escape the monastery and never to return to the monastery again. Now, another factor in the life of Saint Thomas during this time that influenced the life of Saint Thomas is the foundation of the universities. You see, during the 13th century, there was a gradual development in education in the Middle Ages. Okay, but of course, this development started way before the 13th century. The development of education in Europe started around 800 when Charlemagne, king of France, who was who became the Holy Roman Emperor, uh, decided to revive education, learning in Europe. And in order to do this, he established schools in the palaces. This is called the palace schools. Okay, and from the palace schools developed the cathedral schools, the schools that are connected with churches. This time you can call it like a parochial school, but of course the cathedrals are big schools, and were also schools in the countryside. This is the idea of Charlemagne to develop, okay, to develop education, to revive learning in Europe. In history, this is normally called the Carolinian Renaissance. Carolinian Renaissance because from the name of Charles. Uh, so it's a Carolinian Renaissance, meaning it's a revival of learning in Europe. So that started from the 8th century. And the curriculum at the time was restructured. It was developed during this time, and in fact, that curriculum lasted even until the 13th century. Okay, so you have these smaller schools, and then eventually, these smaller schools, especially those schools in the city, united themselves, integrated themselves to form a single unit called now the university. So the university is actually a corporation of different schools. Okay, and the leaders of these schools, the head, the masters of these schools, are called the scholastics. The scholastics. So when you say a scholastic, he is a master, okay, a master of education, the master of learning. And he's not just a master of learning, he masters all the arts and all the sciences. Okay? And their philosophy is called scholastic philosophy. There's no single or uniform doctrine of scholastic philosophy. Only that they are all teachers. They speak one language, which is Latin. They use one method, the method of Aristotle, which is deductive. They studied Greek philosophy, and they follow their faith. Okay? They are loyal to their faith, to their Christian faith, because they are all Christians. So in 3rd century saw the saw the rise of big universities in Europe, University of Naples, University of Cologne, of Paris, etc. So these are big universities, and many of these universities were actually sponsored by the king. University of Naples was actually established by Frederick II. Okay? Aside from the foundation of the university, there was also the abandonment of the feudally constituted society. So for a long time, medieval is feudal. Okay, feudal system. So yeah, in fact, the monastery is an example of the feudal system. So you have the center of power, the monastery, and then you have or like in the case of the nobles, in the case of the monarchy, so you have the monarchy, and then you have all the serfs working for those in power. Okay, so the monasteries with the early medieval character can no longer represent the age that's now coming, emerging. So they have to abandon that feudalistic way of life. Right? All right. Now, next is the triumph of the triumph of Aristotelianism. So we have said that during the early medieval times, the thought was influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy. But before the 3rd century, the philosophy that was taught was and followed in the universities was the Neoplatonic. By Neoplatonic, I mean the new interpretation of Plato's philosophy. And a controversy ensued when some scholars studied the works of Aristotle and adopted his philosophy. Because for the early Christians, the early medieval Christians, Aristotle should not be studied because he is the philosopher of the Arabs. And we know the history of the Arabs and the Christians during the medieval era. So you have to follow the unwritten, I mean the unofficial philosophy, which is the philosophy of Plato, not Aristotle. So those philosophers or scholars who studied Aristotle were some of them were sanctioned, some of them were actually banned from teaching because they thought that the followers of Aristotle is a philosopher of darkness, and those who would study Aristotle would be following darkness. So there was a controversy when some of these scholars studied the works of Aristotle, adopted this philosophy, and in fact started teaching the philosophy of Aristotle in the universities. And Saint Albert the Great and Saint Thomas Aquinas studied and taught the philosophy of Aristotle. So it was rather controversial for them to study and teach the philosophy of Aristotle. But according to St. Thomas, if he studied Aristotle, it was because he can discover truth in Aristotle. Not because he is a pagan or what, but because there are truth that he can discover from Aristotle. Okay, so that's the those are the events that that somehow shape the career, the life of Saint Thomas Aquinas. Okay? So he would be studying in universities. In fact, he will not just be studying in these universities; he would be teaching in these universities, and he will be developing his philosophy based mainly on Aristotle. But of course, he was also influenced by the other philosophies, like the philosophy of Augustine, of Plato, and the other Arab philosophers that he studied. Now we are going to focus on Saint Thomas Aquinas, his life. So we start with the family of Saint Thomas Aquinas. So the father of Saint Thomas is Landolfo. He was a count of Aquino. Aquino is the town of Saint Thomas. I mean, that's where they live. Now, that's the residence of the Aquinos. And his mother is the Countess of Teano, Theodora. So Landolfo and Theodora. His family, as I have already mentioned, is related to the emperors, Emperors Henry the Sixth and Emperor Frederick the Second, and to the kings of Aragon, Castile, and France. So his family is well connected, at least politically, okay? Well connected. Uh, St. Thomas was born around 1224 or 1225 in the castle of Rocaseca near the town of Aquino or in Aquino. So that's, of course, there's no very clear, at the time, no very clear demarcation, right? So that's, as I already mentioned, that's a town between Rome and Naples. So, sorry. So this is a picture of that vicinity of the ruins of that castle of Rocaseca. Now, uh, when he was young, a holy hermit foretold that Thomas, his career, uh, by saying to his mother Theodora before he was born that he will enter the order of the friars preachers, meaning the order of the preachers. And so great will be his learning and sanctity that in his day no one will be found equal to him. So that's a very, that's a very important, it's a very important prophecy because it would actually eventually be true. It will happen. Okay, but of course, at the time, the family, especially the mother, didn't believe this prophecy. In fact, he never wanted his son to be a, a Dominican because at the time, the Dominican, well, it's a new order, and not just a new order. It's an order of beggars, of they are mendicants. So they literally go around begging for food. Okay, and of course the mother Chidora didn't want to see his son to be to be a beggar because of course they belong to a noble family. Right? Now at the age of 5, he and this is based on the custom of the time, he was sent to receive the first training from the Benedictine monks of Monte Cassino. So he was sent to the monastery to be an abbot, or to be a novice, okay, to be a novice or to be an aspirant. And that's I think that custom of sending young children to the monastery to, to be priests or to be monks is, it's not really very, it's a common thing. It's a common thing that you send your child to a monastery, try out if he can be a priest. I think even in Buddhism, like for example, if I'm not mistaken, in Thailand, young boys they're sent to the Buddhist monastery to, to live like monks, and if they want to continue to be monks, then they can continue, but if not, they can just return to their families. Okay, so Saint Thomas uh, was sent to the Benedictine monastery, and the family, and especially the mother, in fact, he was very, very optimistic of the career or the future of Saint Thomas. So they offered him to the abbot as an oblate or novice. And we know that during the time, the abbot is the uncle of Saint Thomas. And the family uh, probably thought that one day he would be the abbot of the monastery. He would one day be the abbot of the monastery. So it was not in it was not in their plan or in their dreams that Saint Thomas would be a Dominican, but they were dreaming that Saint Thomas would be a Benedictine and eventually become the abbot of the monastery. Incidentally, Saint Thomas had several older brothers. He was the youngest son, and his brothers were actually part of the royal army or the imperial army. And early on, they noticed that Saint Thomas is not fond of, of all these military activities. He was more subdued. He was more meditative. So they thought that Saint Thomas would be a priest, and if he will be a priest, then he might as well enter the monastery of the Benedictines. Okay, so he stayed there for 8 or 9 years. Okay, and of course you can just imagine 5 years old. So when he was younger, he was just, playing probably around in the monastery. Uh, but he quickly absorbed the love for the Benedictine way of life, and he showed deep interest in learning and had a very unusual piety and recollection. One anecdote was told about him that would give a kind of clue to his subsequent development, his development as a priest and his development as a learner, a student, philosopher, and theologian. The question was constantly on his lip was, what is the nature of God? Okay? What is the nature of God? It was told that one day, uh, one Benedictine monk observed the young boy Thomas alone in the garden in the courtyard, and was in deep thought as a young boy. And the Benedictine monk approached him and asked, "Tell me, why, my child, what is bothering you?" And Saint Thomas said, "Please tell me, what is the nature of God?" So that has been the constant question of Saint Thomas, a question that will occupy him all throughout his life. His life would be an attempt to answer this question: what is God? What is God? So, of course, he was very diligent in his studies, very meditative. He always asked this question, what is God? But Providence had not ordained that he becomes a Benedictine. He would leave the monastery for several reasons. First, I already mentioned the conflict between the Pope and the Emperor. Okay? And we know, I told you the story about the armed conflict between the Pope and the Emperor. So the the imperial forces attacked the abbey, the the monastery, and Saint Thomas had to escape the monastery together with some other monks. They have to escape from the wrath of the imperial forces. Another factor is the change in the feudal system. Okay, so we have mentioned that during the 13th century, there was a gradual change from the feudal system, uh, the economic system being more open, being more democratic, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the entry into the university. He would enter one of the universities, one of the most prominent universities in Italy. So, at about the year 1239, so he spent there about 8 or 9 years, and then he left the monastery. He actually stayed in their castle at home, and he was actually just staying at their home. And his uncle, who was the abbot, Landulf of Senegal, told his father that Thomas is a bright boy. He's a very talented boy or child, and he should not be left in obscurity just staying at home. He should be sent to the university. So his parents, the father, of course, sent St. Thomas to study at the University of Naples. Okay? And he would soon, in the university, he would soon surpass his early teachers in grammar, and he would then be given to Peter of Ireland, one of the best teachers in the university. And Peter of Ireland would train St. Thomas in logic and the natural sciences. So early on, we can see the uh, the talent of St. Thomas, his passion for teaching or for studies, okay? And the the talent, the intelligence, the capacity, great capacity of his intellect. Now, the custom of the time, I already mentioned about the courses, the curriculum at the time, and the 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 curriculum is actually divided into the liberal arts. No, this curriculum of liberal arts into two courses, namely the trivium and the quadrivium. Okay, so I'll show that to you here. So the trivium are the courses or the subject of on grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So that's the trivium. This is a medieval curriculum. And then the quadrivium is comprised of music, mathematics, geometry, and astronomy. Together with these two courses, the trivium and the quadrivium, you have to study some other subjects, some other courses. Okay, so that it becomes a holistic education. Okay, in fact, there was also gymnastics. No? I think gymnastic would be equivalent to our physical education, physical education today. So these are the typical courses, subjects that you study. And St. Thomas, as a student, could repeat the lessons with more depth and lucidity than his masters or teachers displayed. St. Thomas had a very photographic memory, and he could, he could explain the lesson according to accounts much better than his teachers, because St. Thomas was not just relying on the notes given by his teachers. He was actually practically studying many other sources. Now, the entry into the Dominican Order. So while he was studying in Naples, okay, he lived with his friends, no, his Benedictine friends, But he can also see the city around him. Okay, and he started to think about his vocation, his real vocation. And for him, the monastic life is, well, it is still a very good vocation, it's still a very good congregation, but the monastic life is no longer suited to, to challenge or to face uh, to face the difficulties, the life, and the dangers of the medieval society. So he thought that he saw in the contemporary instruments of providence in the mendicant orders, whose aim was to bring the spirit of the cloister into the public, into the public arena to meet men and to challenge by their example in preaching the new luxury and skepticism. So while he absorbed the Benedictine way of life, for St. Thomas, it's no longer the vocation that is suitable to face the new challenges posed by the new emerging society. So, well, the mendicant orders, both the Franciscans and the Dominicans, they have churches in Naples and they occupy chairs in the university. And he actually frequented this beautiful church of the university run by the Dominicans, the San Domenico Maggiore. And St. Thomas would go there to pray, and soon he would admire the heroism of the Dominican way of life. He became more attracted to the Dominican way of life. He was no under misapprehension. He knew they were really mendicants or really beggars. They traveled where they on foot. They begged their way like paupers, like like poor people. So they live a very heroic, very simple life. But at the same time, although the Dominicans lived in this kind of poverty, they were joyful. They were happy in that kind of life. Well, some people would, wear uh, sad faces when they are living in poverty. But the Dominicans, despite their vow of poverty, were enthusiastic. They were happy. They were joyful in that way of life. And because of that, St. Thomas was attracted to this kind of life. So, uh, Thomas realized, however, that it would create outrage in the family if he would seek their permission to enter the Dominican order. Remember that the family, especially his mother, Theodora, never wanted him to be a Dominican. Okay? She wanted him to be a Benedictine. Okay? So, in April of 1244, without asking from his parents, he asked for the habit of the Dominicans and he received the habit of the Order of St. Dominic. And he was directed by a noted preacher at the convent of Naples, John of St. Julian. So, St. Thomas now is a Dominican. And we can see now that the first part of that prophecy of the hermit becoming true, that he would enter the Dominican order. So, upon knowing that he entered the Dominican order, the family, we suppose the swearing, tried every possible means to dissuade him. And even the city, who knew St. Thomas, wondered why would this young man, belonging to this, well-known and powerful, influential family, would join the poor Dominicans, would join a mendicant order like the Dominicans. So they cannot understand the decision of St. Thomas to join this, what they call, disreputable gang of fanatics, the Dominicans. Okay, so but of course, St. Thomas realized that he was already of age, and therefore he can already decide for himself. So he decided to enter the Dominican Order. But of course, the family tried every means, possible means, to dissuade St. Thomas from pursuing his vocation, priestly vocation, as a Dominican. Now, when she learned of her son's decision, well, the mother, with mingled feelings of joy and sorrow, went to Naples to see her son, to see St. Thomas Aquinas. And the Dominicans feared that the mother would take St. Thomas away from him. So they decided to send St. Thomas to Rome. But his final destination would either be Paris or Cologne. So that's a very long. I mean, if you are from Naples, then you go up to Rome, and then you go up to Paris, and then you go up again to Germany, to Cologne. The final destination is Paris because one of their best teachers, or their best teachers, in fact, Saint Albert the Great, was in Paris. Okay, was in Paris. So that's the final destination. But he would go first to Rome to escape his mother, because his mother is going to Naples, and the Dominicans are afraid that they will take Saint Thomas back. No? So at the instance of Chedora, the mother, St. Thomas's brothers, who were soldiers, as already mentioned, under the emperor, captured St. Thomas near the town of Aquapendente, and they imprisoned him in the fortress of San Giovanni at Rocaseca. Okay. So they abducted St. Thomas, and they put St. Thomas in a castle, in a fortress. And actually, St. Thomas would stay there for 1.5 years as a prisoner. Okay. And during his stay there, he would be, they would be making all these scheme in order to destroy his vocation. So, as I've said, they tried every possible means to dissuade St. Thomas. And one of their schemes was to tempt St. Thomas. So one day, they sent St. Thomas a woman to tempt him. So one night, of course, St. Thomas was alone in this castle. They sent St. Thomas a woman, a prostitute, to tempt St. Thomas. But according to the story, when St. Thomas saw the woman approaching him, he took a torch, okay, a torch, and ran towards the woman to drive the woman away from his room. So the woman hurriedly left, and he left St. Thomas alone. According to to the to to an anecdote, this story, that towards the end of his life, St. Thomas confided to his faithful friend and companion Reginald of Piperno the secret of a remarkable favor he received during the time. And when the tempest had been driven from his chamber, St. Thomas knelt and most earnestly implored God to grant him integrity of mind and body. So he fell into a gentle sleep, and as he slept, two angels appeared to assure him that his prayer had been heard. His prayer was that he remain pure, a virgin, both in mind and in body. So they girded him with a white girdle, and the angels said, "We gird you with a girdle of perpetual virgin. And from that day forward, St. Thomas never experienced the slightest motion of lust or concupiscence. So St. Thomas proved to his family, his mother and his siblings, that he was really decided to continue his priestly vocation. So they left St. Thomas alone and eventually allowed St. Thomas to continue his journey and to continue his stay with the Dominican. St. Thomas stayed in that in that fortress for all 1.5 to 2 years. But one of his sisters actually sent him books to read. So while he was in prison, St. Thomas was actually studying. He never missed his studies. He was continually studying and reading and reading. So it's as if nothing, he did not miss anything. So these are the books that he procured, that his sister procured for him: the Bible, Aristotle's Metaphysics, and that's a book by Aristotle, and the sentences of Peter Lombard. The sentences, there are 4 books of these sentences. It's actually a summary of the theological doctrines of the church. So all throughout his stay, he was actually studying there. So after several months, 18 to 2 years, they saw that the prophecy of the hermit would eventually be fulfilled, and therefore they eventually let go of St. Thomas. So St. Thomas held with unyielding resolution to his noble decision, and realizing his determination, brothers relaxed their watch and set him free. And later his family accepted his decision. He then returned to studies in Naples. Okay, so he would continue study in Naples instead of proceeding to Rome. He went back to Naples. The Dominicans were delighted to find that during his captivity, St. Thomas had made much progress, as if he was been studying in a studium generale. A studium generale it's a general school. It's a preparatory school for priesthood. Okay, so reunion with the Dominicans. So Thomas immediately pronounced vows, and after pronouncing his vows in Naples, he was sent to Rome. Okay, he was sent to Rome, and Innocent IV, the Pope, examined closely into his motives in joining the friar preachers, and dismissed him with a blessing, and forbade any further interference with his vocation. The master of the Dominican Order, John the Teutonic, took the young student to Paris. So from Rome, so Naples, then he would travel to Rome, and then he would continue to Paris, and then he would go to Cologne, and he would arrive in 1244 or 1245, and would be placed under the guidance of the most renowned professor of the Dominicans, Saint Albert the Great. Saint Albert the Great would be the teacher of Saint Thomas Aquinas. Now let's talk more about the Dominicans in order for us to understand the vocation, the charism of Saint Thomas. The Dominican charism is preaching. That's why they are called the Order of Preachers. And their charism is encapsulated in this saying: contemplare et contemplata aliis tradere, which means to contemplate or to reflect and share the fruit of contemplation. So how do we share the fruit of contemplation? Well, we need to preach. So the other preoccupation of Dominicans, aside from prayer, from meditation, from contemplation, is preaching. So they have to meditate, they have to contemplate, but they have to share through their preaching the fruits of their contemplation. So it's important for the Dominicans to always preach, and teaching in the university is one form of preaching. Now, of course, they have this vow of poverty. They have the evangelical vow of poverty that would preserve them against the seduction of this new economic order and free them from the dead weight of the feudal system. So even if they go out to preach, mingle with men, with with the public, they are shielded from this seduction because of this uh, vow of poverty. So the Dominicans and of course the Franciscans were the first model of this kind of religious life. We know, of course, the story of Saint Dominic and Saint Francis. Okay, they were, of course, they renounced their properties. Saint Francis renounced uh, his luxurious life in order to live a simple and very frugal life. Okay? So when he entered the Dominican order, Saint Thomas' goal was clear. That is to follow God and to pursue the truth. To follow God and to pursue the truth. So very important for Saint Thomas Aquinas. Two factors that have significant effects on his quest for God and truth. First, the charism of the Dominicans, and second, his concern for philosophy, especially for the philosophy of Aristotle. Of course, he also studied other philosophies, but his main influence was Aristotle. Okay, so just to show you a picture of the Dominicans praying at the foot of the cross. By the way, Saint Thomas would usually pray at the foot of the cross. He would prostrate himself at the foot of the cross as he prays. Now, his study under Saint Albert the Great. The meeting between Albert the Great and Saint Thomas Aquinas was a momentous one. Saint Albert the Great was already studying Aristotle's philosophy, and he engaged on the task of winning over opinion to this system. So Saint Albert the Great is a genius. Normally we append the term the great to a person after he dies. So when somebody dies and we know him to be a great person, then we say the great. But Albert the Great, because of his encyclopedic mind, he was already referred to as the great even when he was still alive. So scholars during the era referred to Albert as Albertus Magnus, meaning Albert the Great, even while he was still alive. And he was studying the philosophy of Aristotle. So St. Thomas, when he went to Paris and then eventually Cologne, when he was under the guidance of Albert the Great, needed that kind of enthusiastic teacher of encyclopedic learning to also stimulate his own genius and to broaden his own perspective. So he he was inspired by Saint Albert the Great. Now, in the school, Saint Thomas's humility and were he's a very quiet man, very mild mannered, and in the school when he was studying, especially when he was already in under the guidance of Albert the Great, this simplicity, this humility was interpreted as a sign of dullness. And he is usually called the dumb Sicilian ox. Ox because one, St. Thomas is a huge fellow. He has the Germanic blood in him. Sicilian because we know he's from southern Italy. And dumb because they thought he is dumb because he is very quiet. Okay, he's very quiet and he's very humble. So one day, while Saint Albert the Great was giving a course on a philosopher, he's a Greek philosopher. He's called Dionysius the Areopagite. He's a Greek philosopher. He came across some of the notes that Saint Thomas wrote. Remember what I said, that he could, uh, he could understand the lesson way better than his teachers. He can actually explain the lessons clearly than his teachers way back in Naples. So Saint Albert was rather surprised, astonished by the profoundness and accuracy of the notes that Saint Thomas had taken in his class. So he decided to test the silent Thomas and told Saint Thomas that he must prepare for a public debate in class. Before, normally, the mode of instruction is always lectio, meaning lecture. So just sit and then listen to the professor read the notes, read the lecture, practically reading from his book. But from time to time, there will be a disputatio. Disputatio is a debate. It could either be a debate or some kind of a discussion between the student and the teacher. But sometimes the debate could be between a student and another student. So it will not just be a discussion, it will actually be a debate in front of the class. And the classmates of St. Thomas was, of course, they were excited because, one, at least they will not be listening to probably a boring lecture. And they will be entertained by St. Thomas because they thought, well, this is going to be fun and entertaining. Imagine this dumb student, dumb student, having a public debate with another student. So, this will be an hour's amusement at the discomfort of St. Thomas. However, when the day came, St. Thomas' performance in the debate was masterful. It was clear, it was penetrating, convincing. And Albert the Great was impressed. And he told his students, the classmates of St. Thomas, he said, and this is a very important uh, quote, no, uh, a very important, uh, what they call this, a description of St. Thomas, or some kind of a prophecy, if you can say. He said, we call this young man dumb ox, but mark my word, that's word, mark my word, his bellowing in doctrine will one day resound throughout the world. So we call him to be dumb today, but remember, one day he will impress the whole world. And from that moment on, Saint Albert the Great took Saint Thomas Aquinas as his disciple, as his favorite student. So there are many anecdotes about the life of Saint Thomas, and he would always join Saint during his studies. He would always join Saint Albert the Great. Now there's a story about Saint Thomas. Again, another anecdote about Saint Thomas, that one day during the break in their classes probably, or while they were just spending some free time, a Dominican told Saint Thomas. Of course, this is a joke on Saint Thomas. He said, look, Thomas, there's a flying horse outside." And Thomas went over the window and asked, "Where?" And the Dominicans, his classmates, laughed at Saint Thomas, and they told Thomas, "Thomas, would you believe that a horse can fly?" And the quiet Thomas said, "Well, I would rather believe that a horse can fly than for a Dominican to tell a lie." There you go, St. Thomas. Because one of the virtues of the Dominicans is veritas, truth, truth. And he cannot accept in himself a Dominican would be lying. He would rather believe that a horse can fly than for a Dominican not to tell the truth. Okay, so in 1248, Albert was asked to go there as a master in Cologne. From Paris, Albert was assigned to Cologne, and St. Thomas accompanied St. Thomas or St. Albert the Great in Cologne. And he would stay in Cologne for another 4 years for his further philosophical formation. Okay. Now, but at the time, when you say you are a doctor or a master of, meaning you have already completed the highest level of education. So, parehas lang dito sa atin. Okay. So, after the completion of studies, he started to write. He would begin the blessed output of great works in theology and philosophy. He would continue writing and writing until his death. So he was 31 when he was promoted to mastership or doctorate in theology. And never again until almost 20 years later, when after a mystical experience, would St. Thomas lay down his pen and enjoy some leisure. Okay? So there would be no rest for St. Thomas after he was promoted to doctorate or mastership in theology. He would be teaching and writing. He would be traveling from university to university, teaching in the universities, writing his books, writing the Summa, and so on and so forth. So St. Thomas did not enjoy any leisure all throughout this year because he was very busy in his task of teaching and writing. Now, his travels. So he traveled around, as I've said. There was actually a some kind of a tour of the Summa because when he is the Summa is his important work. I will say something about the Summa later. So he would travel from one university to another university. Wherever he's needed, he will be assigned there. So he would go to Naples, then to Cologne, then to Paris, and among other things, among other places. Okay? So Paris would claim him as her own, uh, and the popes would wish to have him near them because he usually served as advisor to the popes. He is the theologian of the pope. Of course, there are other theologians of the pope, but many popes during his time, they would want St. Thomas to be their, advisor in theology. So the studia of the order, meaning by studia, these are the uh, house of studies of the order, because the Dominicans were already increasing in number, so they were now opening convents or schools, to accept recruits, and of course they will have to study. So every school of the Dominicans is eager to have St. Thomas with them to teach them. Okay? So we find him successively in Anagni. These are the places where the Dominicans have houses. In Rome, in Bologna, in Orvieto, Viterbo, Perugia, then in Paris, then eventually he settled in Naples. So, but he's been traveling around teaching and writing. So always teaching and writing, living on earth with one passion, and ardent zeal for the explanation and defense of the Christian truth. Now, the last years of St. Thomas. St. Thomas spent his last 1.5 years at the University of Naples. He was teaching theology there and writing the Summa and various commentaries. And in December of 1273, he experienced what we call the beatific vision. What is this beatific vision? Beatific vision is being face to face with God. So it's a vision of God, seeing God face to face. I said that when St. Thomas prayed, he would pray at the foot of the cross. And one moment while he was praying, he levitated and he was like in a trance. And according to the account, he talked to God, literally, face to face with God. And after that experience of being face to face with God, St. Thomas put down his pen and would not write anymore. So he didn't write anymore, never wanted to write anymore. He said, I cannot, meaning he can no longer write, cannot continue writing. Such things have been revealed to me, that all that I have written seems to me so much strong. He spent his whole life asking the question, what is God? And has written so much about God. And then, in one experience, everything was revealed to him, who God is. And he realized that all that he has written about God was nothing compared to the immensity, to the greatness, the perfection of God. He actually wanted to burn his books, the Summa, because for him, it did not do justice to God. He had written so much, but all that he had written was nothing compared to the greatness of God. You see, St. Thomas spent his life thinking, reflecting, contemplating, and writing about God. And in that vision, he was actually asked by God, he was asked, Thomas, you have written well of me. What do you ask from me? And St. Thomas said, nothing but you, Lord. Nothing but you, Lord. And he was rewarded with that experience of being face to face with God. You see, two things must happen for us to be face to face with God. First, we need to die to be face to face with God, because we cannot be face to face with God in our physical form. But St. Thomas accomplished that, achieved that in his physical form. The second condition is that we need to live a very holy life. If we don't live a very holy life, we may be face to face with the devil. So St. Thomas lived a very holy life. In fact, he is known as the Angelic Doctor. Doctor because of his great mind, angelic because he was holy as an angel. So although he was urged to continue writing, he would not write anymore. He decided to put down his pen and would not write anymore. Okay? So December 6, 1273, decided not to write anymore. But as we have said, he was always invited by the Pope to give the Pope counsel, to give the Pope advice. And one day, he was, while on his way to Lyons, upon the summon of the Pope, Pope Gregory X, to attend the church council, which is aimed at reuniting with the Greek church, St. Thomas got sick. And just a backgrounder on this church council. You see, this is already 1273. Okay? 10th century or 11th century, there was the Great Schism. What is this Great Schism? It is the separation of the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church. So the separation, before there was just one church, but there were two centers of powers, Rome and Turkey or Istanbul, or the Greek Church. And the two churches were separated for quite some time. So there was an effort to reconcile the two churches. So the Pope asked St. Thomas to go to Lyons to be the theologian, to join, to attend this council aimed at reuniting with the Eastern Church, the Western Church and the Eastern Church, the Roman and the Greek Church, the churches. Okay, but on his way there, he got sick. Okay, he got sick, and he was taken to a nearby monastery. Oh, by the way, it was not just Saint Thomas who acted or served as a theologian for the Pope. There was another saint, a Franciscan saint, who is a contemporary of Saint Thomas, and that is Saint Bonaventure. So the two, Saint Thomas Aquinas and Saint Bonaventure, were actually contemporaries. But Saint Thomas is a Dominican, Saint Bonaventure is a Franciscan, and they were quite rival in writings, because Saint Bonaventure follows the Neoplatonic tradition, and Saint Thomas followed the Aristotelian tradition. So there was a friendly competition between the two saints, you know? And they were both favorite of the Pope. So they were both asked to, to attend. Saint Thomas got sick, never made it to the council, but Saint Bonaventure made it to the council. Okay, but months later, after Saint Thomas died, Saint Bonaventure would also die. Okay, but anyway, so that's how you know related the life of these two saints are. So when he got sick, he stayed at his sister's house, and later on, he was taken to the monastery of the Cistercian of Fossanova. So the Cistercian is another congregation. So he was brought to that monastery, and he was actually taken care of there. Okay, so the Cistercian monks of Fossanova pressed him to accept their hospitality, and so he went to the monastery. And upon entering the monastery, he whispered to his companion. He said, "This is my rest forever and ever. Here will I dwell, for I have chosen it." Of course, probably his companion was wondering what does he mean. But, you know, months later, March 7, 1274, at the age of 49, St. Thomas died in that monastery. So he was very young, 49 years old. So we see that St. Thomas's career in higher studies ended where it had begun, at the University of Naples. He studied there, and then when he died, he was actually teaching at that university. And his life also ended where it had begun, in a monastery. He entered a Benedictine monastery when he was young, to begin his religious life, and he died in the Cistercian monastery. So the University of Paris, of course, requested that his body be brought there, but it remained for a time at the Cistercian monastery. So later, his bones were taken to the Dominican house in Toulouse, in France. And Albert the Great outlived St. Thomas, and he was deeply heartbroken when his favorite disciple, whom he called the flower and glory of existence, died. So, influenced after his death, after the death of St. Thomas, some of his teachings were condemned. So you will be surprised. How could his teachings, like the Summa Theologiae, was even prohibited to be read in Franciscan schools? Because at the time, there was always that controversy in teaching philosophy. Okay? He was teaching Aristotle, and there was controversy in the philosophy of Aristotle. So there were some condemnation of the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas after he died. But after his teachings were re-evaluated, the condemnation was reversed, and 12, almost 50 years later, the Church through Pope John the 22nd canonized Saint Thomas and raised him up as a scholar saint. And he would be given the title the Angelic Doctor. Of course, there are many other titles that we give to Saint Thomas. Many call him the Prince of the Scholastics. Okay? But the Angelic Doctor is a title that really stick to Saint Thomas. In the 19th century, with the Neo-Thomistic movement, the philosophy of Saint Thomas was revived, and Pope Leo XIII, in 1879, in his encyclical letter Aeterni Patris, declared that the philosophy of Saint Thomas as the official philosophy of the Roman Catholic Church. That's why those who study in the seminary to become priests, one of the philosophies or philosophers that they study is Saint Thomas Aquinas. Okay. Now, oh, by the way, some more stories about the life of Saint Thomas. Saint Thomas, of course, he wrote so many books, but he also have written a lot of prayers, and as I already mentioned, that he was a favorite of the Pope. So one day, the Pope asked him what the Church can give to Saint Thomas as a kind of reward for all his loyal, faithful service to the Church, especially to the Church. And normally, the reward would be in the form of appointment or promotion. So people would be appointed as cardinal or archbishop. So he was offered to be a cardinal as a kind of honor to Saint Thomas. But Saint Thomas declined, never wanted position in the church. So the Pope asked him, well, if you don't want this promotion, what would you ask from the church? And what Saint Thomas asked is that a feast be celebrated in honor of the body of Christ. That's the Corpus Christi. The Corpus Christi is a feast celebrating the body of Christ. And that was the request of St. Thomas Aquinas as a kind of reward for him, okay, for his services to the church. So you see the kind of humility that St. Thomas had. Okay. All right, now let's move on to St. Thomas as a student. So here are some of the qualities of St. Thomas as a student. St. Thomas was always inquisitive, was constantly asking questions and searching for answers. Second, serenity, that he had this quiet disposition to focus and to reflect on his object of contemplation, which is something that's very difficult to do nowadays. Focus and reflect on our object of our contemplations. During this time, it's very difficult to just focus, much more to be serene, no, amidst all this pandemic. Humility. He was always humble. He stays grounded despite his intelligence and always respectful of the ideas of others. He would always engage in debate. He would, because of the controversy surrounding the philosophy that he's preaching, he would always be, in constant discussion with different people. But he remains respectful of the ideas of others, even if he disagrees with those ideas. Next, innovativeness. He always considers new ways of learning, new ways of reorganizing and developing his works. Well, yes, he was influenced by the other philosophers, by Aristotle, by Plato, Augustine, Avicenna, and many other philosophers, but he organized, developed his ideas in a new way, in a unique way. Courage. He does not hesitate to express his views, and he always defends his position. Remember the controversy about Aristotle, but he's always courageous to seek the truth from whatever source. And perseverance. He was firm in facing difficulties and struggles, never lost sight of his vocation and obligations. Now, let's discuss St. Thomas as a teacher. So, the career of St. Thomas as a teacher started when was when he was appointed when he was appointed to teach at the University of Paris, and he delivered his inaugural lecture between June September of 1256. You don't only defend, but you also have to deliver a lecture. Okay? So this lecture of St. Thomas contained his teaching about God's gift, the gift of God, wisdom. Okay, wisdom. How wisdom may reach the lowest creatures by going through the immediate one. So, meaning knowledge is from God, and then it reaches the mind of the young people. But between God and the student, the young people, the young mind, there is a conduit. There is a channel of that wisdom. And the channel of that wisdom is the teacher. Okay? So from God, wisdom, then teacher, then the student. Okay? That is the idea of St. Thomas about teaching. So this lecture of St. Thomas contained his teaching on the function and qualities of a teacher. According to St. Thomas, to teach is to cause knowledge on others. And this would mean that the teacher becomes the instrumental cause, the instrument, the means for others to acquire knowledge. So knowledge, the source of knowledge, wisdom is God. It will pass to the teacher. So the teacher is a channel of that wisdom and on to the mind of the students. So for St. Thomas, the teacher is a very important channel of wisdom. Okay? And therefore, if he is the channel, he must have mastery of the subject that he's teaching. And he must be able to communicate clearly to students this teaching, this truth. Now, for St. Thomas, we have three functions as teachers. First, to preach. To preach is just to give instruction. Okay? So, we just give instruction preaching. Like, for example, in the church, the priest, during the sermon, they preach. They give instruction about the gospel, about the doctrines of the church, and so on and so forth. The second is to teach. And this is the higher function, because now we are not just giving instruction, we're trying to convince our students or the students of the truth of what you are teaching. In the church, when the priest preach or preaches, well, the faithful may be convinced or not convinced. But if you are in the class, if you are teaching, you cannot just give instruction. You have to convince your student about the doctrines. So if I am teaching you right now about St. Thomas, I'm not just giving you some information about St. Thomas. I'm trying to convince you that this is St. Thomas, and these are the lessons we can learn from St. Thomas. That's teaching. Okay? And the last one is to dispute, to argue. So it's not just to defend, or it's not just to convince others of the truth of your teaching, but to defend the truth of your teaching. So if one would question the truth of that teaching, you need to defend. You need to argue. Okay? You need to discourse and prove that your teaching, the truth of your teaching, is genuine. It's true. Now, that's a very tall order for the teachers. And for St. Thomas, For us to be able to do that as teachers, we need to have certain qualities. And the teacher that St. Thomas is talking about is actually the teachers of the church, meaning the priests. Priest, that's the highest form of teacher. The magister. Okay? But of course, we can also apply this to ordinary teachers now. So what are the qualities of this teacher? One, immaculate in his life. Wow, that's a very high, what do you call this? That's a very high standard. Immaculate in life. Immaculate means no sin, clean in one's life. When I was reading this, I was thinking, if UST will make that as a condition for someone to teach in the university, that they will only accept teachers who are immaculate in their lives, I don't know if there will be teachers in UST. For one, I will not be here. Immaculate in life. The second, he must be understanding in the acceptance of his ministry. Because this task of being a teacher is a vocation. It's a vocation. It's a ministry for St. Thomas. And he must be obedient to God's will. He must be faithful to God and be obedient to God's will. So obviously, these qualities of the teacher is for the priests. But well, we can also probably apply this to ordinary, regular teachers like us. At least approximate this, this immaculate life. Okay. Anyway, okay. So I will end this discussion on the life of Saint Thomas with this quotation. The things that we love tell us what we are. These are the sources that I use in that lecture.